In the heart of Kentucky's hills stood a home built for the lost, yet those who entered seemed never to leave, in body or in time. What began as charity soon twisted into something the town dared not name. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where we open the creaking doors of history's most unsettling stories and invite you to step inside. I'm your host, and tonight's journey takes us to rural Kentucky at the very end of the 19th century. It is a place that, on paper, should have been one of mercy, compassion, and salvation for the most vulnerable members of society. An orphanage, built with the supposed intention of sheltering children who had nowhere else to go. Yet behind those solemn brick walls, a far stranger and far more chilling legacy took root. For this was no ordinary institution. According to local records, to county ledgers, and even to eyewitness accounts that have survived over the decades, St. Hallow's Orphanage was a place where no child was ever born, and where no child was ever said to have died. That, in itself, might seem like an odd clerical detail, the sort of mistake that dusty records and inattentive bureaucrats might allow to slip through the cracks. But, as we will see tonight, the truth of St. Hallow's goes far deeper, and what makes it so terrifying is not merely the lack of paperwork, but the unnatural silence that surrounded every aspect of its existence. In 1898, when the first stone was laid on the Kentucky hillside that would come to house St. Hallow's, the people of the nearby town believed it to be an act of charity. The Reverend Silas Grieve, a stern man of somber reputation, and his devoted sister Margaret, were praised for establishing a home for abandoned children, a place that promised hope and stability, at a time when disease, mining accidents, and poverty left far too many youngsters without families. At first, it seemed like an answer to prayer. Yet, almost immediately, murmurs began to surface among the townsfolk, murmurs that grew into something darker. Deliveries were made to the orphanage gates, but the children rarely came into town. They were glimpsed only occasionally, pale faces behind shuttered windows, silent figures in the chapel pews when Sunday services demanded their attendance. Something about them seemed different. The same faces reappeared year after year, with none seeming to grow older, none seeming to vanish, and none ever replaced by new arrivals. Before we proceed, I must caution you. This tale is not one of comforting nostalgia or sentimental reflection on bygone times. What you are about to hear belongs instead to the shadows of history, where compassion curdled into obsession, and where innocence may have been bound by forces that neither medicine nor faith could fully explain. The story of St. Hallow's Orphanage is one that blurs the line between record and legend, between tragedy and nightmare. And while some of what we will discuss is verified by documents preserved in county archives, much of it exists in the liminal space of folklore, testimony, and rumor, the kind of testimony whispered by those who claimed to have seen things they wished they could forget. So dim your lights, settle in, and prepare yourself. For tonight, we are not simply recounting the history of a building, we are stepping into a world where the natural order itself may have been suspended. Where the cycle of birth and death, the very rhythm of life, was said to have been halted within the walls of a Kentucky orphanage in 1898. This is the story of a place where no one was ever born, no one was ever buried, and no one, it is said, ever truly died. And what we will uncover may leave you questioning whether some traditions of mercy can conceal something far more sinister. In the year 1898, deep in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky, the foundation stones of a new orphanage were laid. It was christened St. Hallow's Home, a name that suggested sanctuary, holiness, and safety for those who had none. Its founders were Reverend Silas Grieve and his sister Margaret, a pair who, to the casual eye, seemed committed to a life of service and charity. Silas was a man of imposing stature, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to look straight through whoever stood before him. Margaret, quiet and deliberate in her manner, was the one most often seen in town, purchasing supplies and speaking softly of her hopes for the children they would care for. Together, they were presented as benefactors, determined to turn grief into mercy, by giving abandoned children a home. But there was an unsettling detail that went unnoticed, or at least unremarked upon, by most at the time: the land they chose for their grand project. St. Hallow's home was not built on some gentle meadow or fertile valley. Instead, its walls rose upon the decaying remains of an abandoned frontier fort, a relic from the violent days of the early 1800s. Local hunters and farmers knew the ruins well. The crumbling stockades and scattered stone foundations had been left to rot for decades, overgrown with weeds and avoided by the superstitious. Stories persisted that the fort had been cursed, the soldiers stationed there having perished in strange and sudden ways. Illness, unexplained disappearances, even whispered rumors of desertions driven by madness. Whatever the truth, the land bore a reputation that kept most folk at a distance. And yet, Reverend Grieve insisted the site was chosen with divine purpose. He preached that the ground, once stained by violence, could be redeemed through acts of charity. Margaret echoed his conviction, though those who spoke to her privately recalled her words carried a certain hesitancy, as if she herself had not been fully convinced of her brother's decision. Still, the orphanage rose swiftly. Brick by brick, stone by stone, the ruins of the fort were built into the foundations of St. Hallow's home. By autumn, its spire pierced the Kentucky sky, its windows glinting in the pale light of shorter days. From a distance it might have seemed like a beacon of hope. Up close, however, the heavy walls and barred gates suggested something far less welcoming. The town gathered to celebrate its opening, praising Reverend Grieve's devotion and Margaret's sacrifice. A ribbon was cut, prayers were said, and food was shared. Yet some locals could not shake the chill that clung to the air around the building. There was something unnatural about its presence on that old ground. A few even swore they could still hear faint echoes of the fort's distant shouts, phantom drums woven into the cold wind that swept the hilltop. Whatever St. Hallow's was meant to be, it was born already shadowed by the past, and those shadows would never truly lift. The first children of St. Hallow's home came not from far-off cities or charitable networks but from a sudden local tragedy that struck the town in the summer of 1898. A mine collapse, violent and unforgiving, swallowed dozens of men alive, leaving their families shattered in a single afternoon. 23 children, stripped of fathers, and in some cases of both parents, found themselves with nowhere to go. It was a catastrophe that might have destroyed the community had Reverend Silas Grieve not stepped forward with uncanny timeliness. His new orphanage, still smelling of fresh mortar and sawdust, opened its doors to the children, as though fate had designed it for this very moment. To many, it seemed divine providence. The local paper declared it God's blessing, a haven arriving just when it was most desperately needed. Townsfolk gathered outside the iron gates to watch the procession of children climb the hill, small faces smeared with soot and grief, their belongings clutched in ragged bundles. They entered St. Hallow's in silence, the great doors closing behind them, and for a time the town rejoiced that misfortune had been answered with mercy. Yet even in that first week, the whispers began. Those who visited with donations of blankets or food remarked on the quiet that filled the orphanage halls. The children rarely spoke above a whisper, and their eyes held a dullness that unsettled even the most generous visitors. They were clean, they were fed, yet they seemed somehow unchanged, as though their grief had frozen them in place. Weeks passed, then months, and the same small figures could sometimes be glimpsed through the shuttered windows or walking in pairs around the grounds. At first, people chalked up their stillness to the trauma of their loss, but unease began to spread when, year after year, the children who had entered St. Hallow's seemed to remain exactly as they had on that first day. The faces peering from the windows did not lengthen into adolescence. The clothing, though repaired and refitted, seemed always to hang from the same small shoulders. And when townsfolk asked Reverend Grieve about the children's progress, his answers were vague, evasive, sometimes delivered with a cold finality that discouraged further questions. It might have been dismissed as superstition or gossip had the county clerk not taken notice. In reviewing the records, she found no birth certificates, no adoption papers, no records of deaths. For decades, the ledgers for St. Hallows remained blank, as though the children within had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the state. No new orphans were ever officially recorded as arriving, and none were ever noted as leaving. The town celebrated what it believed to be a miracle of mercy, but the paperwork painted a far stranger picture. 23 children went into St. Hallow's home in 1898, and from that moment forward, on paper at least, they had vanished. When historians and local researchers look back on the strange history of St. Blank 23, Hallow's home, one of the most baffling and terrifying details is not found in eyewitness accounts or whispered legends, but in something far more mundane: the county's official ledgers. These were the records meant to account for life and death, the bureaucratic spine of any community: birth certificates filed when a child entered the world, death certificates issued when a life came to its natural end, and burial permits ensuring the proper handling of the deceased. Yet across 40 years of the orphanage's operation, there is a void where there should have been reams of paperwork. Not a single birth, not a single death, not even a single burial permit was ever filed on behalf of St. Hallows. This absence would be remarkable enough if the orphanage had been a small institution, one that housed only a handful of children at a time. But dozens of children were said to live there throughout its existence. Townsfolk remembered seeing them, small faces peering from the iron gates, silent lines of them walking stiffly to Sunday service, pale hands clutching hymnals in the back pews. Schoolteachers noted their absences when asked why none of the orphans attended local lessons, and shopkeepers recalled Reverend Grieve ordering shoes and coats in childlike sizes year after year. These children were visible, tangible, undeniably present. And yet, according to the county's records, they had never existed at all. The anomaly came to light when a diligent clerk attempted to reconcile census records with county registries. She noted, with growing unease, that St. Hallows was listed in every census, and always with a steady number of residents. Yet none of the names corresponded to any other document in the state. Children appeared in the census again and again, their ages unchanged, their names repeated every decade as though frozen in time. Joseph, 8 years old, in 1900. Joseph, 8 years old, again in 1910. In 1920, still. Joseph, 8 years old. The same was true for many others. Clara, 9. Henry, 11. Miriam, 7. The county clerk described it later in her private journal as a catalogue of phantoms, names trapped in a kind of administrative purgatory. Oh. When she brought her concerns to her superiors, she was told to leave the matter alone. St. Hallows was a church-run institution, they reminded her, and the Reverend was a respected figure. To question his records was to invite suspicion of blasphemy, or worse. Still, rumors spread. How could so many children live within those walls, visible to the town yet invisible to the laws of life and death? Some believed the Reverend had simply failed in his paperwork, neglecting what he deemed worldly requirements. Others whispered of darker possibilities, that no certificates existed because no child within St. Hallows ever truly crossed the threshold of life or death. They remained in a suspended state, never aging, never dying, never officially recorded in the great ledger of humanity. It is this void in the county's files, this paper trail that leads only into silence, that makes St. Hallows' story so difficult to dismiss. The children may not have left behind birth certificates or death records, but they left behind an impression on those who saw them, a presence that lingered like a question without an answer. And in the absence of paperwork, one is left to wonder, were these children ever meant to be accounted for at all? Dr. Elias Whitaker was the town physician, a man whose reputation for diligence and methodical record-keeping made him a natural choice to oversee the health of St. Hallows' home. Beginning in the autumn of 1898, only months after the first orphans were brought through its doors, he was tasked with visiting the orphanage regularly, checking on the welfare of the children, and ensuring that Reverend Grieve and his sister Margaret were providing the proper standard of care. In the beginning, he approached the duty as he did all others with clinical detachment, a bag of instruments in hand, and a sense of obligation to his community. But as the months passed, his journals began to reflect a growing unease, notes that shifted from detached medical observation into something far darker. The children, he wrote, were unlike any he had encountered in his years of practice. They were frail in appearance, their skin pale to the point of translucence, with veins visible just beneath the surface, like faint blue lines on parchment. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as though each gesture required thought. And yet, when Whitaker examined them, he found little to diagnose. Their pulses were steady, though faint. Their breathing shallow but regular. Their lungs clear of infection. Their bodies free of fever. They were never truly healthy, but neither were they sick. It was as though they lingered in a space between conditions, immune to illness, yet incapable of thriving. Children frail, pale, he wrote in one entry from 1901, yet never sick enough to die. Their eyes seem vacant, their affect flat. They do not complain, nor do they laugh. They answer questions, but with hesitation, as though retrieving words from some deep and distant place. It is unnatural. He began to note peculiar consistencies that unsettled him further. Their temperatures rarely fluctuated beyond a narrow range, always lower than expected. Their hearts beat slower than a child's should, almost in unison with one another, as if governed by some shared rhythm. And strangest of all, they bore no signs of growth. Month after month, their limbs remained the same length, their features unchanging. Whitaker confided in his journals that he feared something was being done to them, some experiment or regimen that dulled their vitality while keeping them tethered to life. He suspected sedatives, perhaps even poisons, but when he tested for residues, he found nothing conclusive. Instead, he began to describe an atmosphere that seemed to permeate the orphanage itself. A heaviness as though the very air resisted vitality. The children were not merely pale because of poor diet or lack of sun, he reasoned. They were pale because something unnatural clung to them, something that prevented them from living fully, yet would not allow them to die. His final surviving note from 1904 reads more like a plea than an observation. I leave each visit with a weight upon my chest, as if part of their stillness follows me home. The Reverend insists that all is well, that the children are blessed in their preservation, untouched by sickness. But preservation is not the same as life. I fear I have stumbled upon a truth that should not be witnessed, and I do not know how much longer I can continue. After that, his visits stopped being recorded in the county log, though townsfolk whispered that Whitaker had grown increasingly reclusive, unwilling to speak of St. Hallows again. Whatever he saw within those walls, whatever he tried to capture in his meticulous notes, suggested that the orphanage was not merely a house for children, it was a house for something that defied the very rhythm of life itself. As the years passed, the townsfolk began to notice something deeply unsettling about the children of St. Proce. Hallows. At first, it was dismissed as a trick of memory or the exaggeration of gossip, but with each passing season the evidence became harder to ignore. The children were seen rarely, usually in fleeting glimpses through iron gates or on the narrow paths that led them to the chapel on Sundays. Their faces were pale, their expressions muted, and their voices seldom rose above whispers when they sang hymns in the back pews. But what struck people most, and what eventually grew into the whispers that haunted the town, was that those same faces seemed to remain unchanged, year after year. The blacksmith's wife, who had delivered milk to the orphanage since the day it opened, was among the first to remark upon it. She swore that the small boy she saw clutching a wooden toy horse in 1899 was the same boy she glimpsed nearly a decade later, standing just inside the gates, the toy still in his hand, his face no older, his body no taller. A group of farmhands returning from Sunday service in 1907 claimed that the girls who walked in pairs to the chapel were the very same they had seen in their youth, their dresses patched but their faces unaged, as though frozen in time. By 1910, the whispers had taken root across the entire town. The orphans of St. Hallow's never grew older. Some townsfolk tried to explain it away, insisting that new children must have arrived to replace the old, and that the likenesses were merely coincidental. But others kept careful watch, noting the names and faces that never seemed to change. Joseph, always 8 years old. Clara, always 9. Henry, always 11. These children, spoken of as though they were part of the town itself, remained trapped in a strange stasis that defied reason. Parents warned their own children not to linger near the orphanage, lest whatever curse held those within might spread. Even the local priest, Reverend Callahan, struggled to find words when pressed about the matter. He admitted quietly that he, too, had noticed it, though he cautioned against drawing conclusions. "Perhaps they are blessed," he told his congregation, "preserved by God's grace." Yet his trembling hands and the unease in his eyes betrayed a different belief, one he dared not voice from the pulpit. By the second decade of the orphanage's existence, fear had woven itself into the fabric of the town. People crossed the street rather than walk along the orphanage wall. Delivery men left packages at the gate and hurried away without waiting for acknowledgement. And still, the same children's faces appeared behind those darkened windows, unchanging, unwavering, and timeless. The question that lingered was one no one dared to ask aloud. What manner of place could hold a child outside the reach of time itself? Each Sunday, the people of the town would gather in the old stone chapel that sat just beyond the orphanage gates. It was a modest building, plain and austere, with tall, narrow windows that allowed beams of light to spill across the pews. The orphanage children were always present. They would arrive in careful lines, led by Reverend Grieve at the front and Margaret following behind, their small forms dressed in identical dark garments. They filed into the rear pews without speaking, their footsteps soft on the wooden floor, their eyes lowered as though they wished to avoid the gaze of the congregation. Week after week, their attendance was as certain as the tolling of the chapel bell, and yet something about their presence unsettled those who came to worship. The oddest detail, the one that came to define the way people remembered those Sundays, was the silence. Children are rarely quiet in church. Their voices typically rise above the hymns, sometimes shrill, sometimes off, key, but always full of life. But at St. Hallow's services, no such sounds were ever heard. When the congregation sang, the voices of the townsfolk carried the hymns, but the children's voices, if they were present at all, were no more than faint murmurs, hushed and toneless. Some swore the children never opened their mouths, that the sound was imagined, or worse, that it came not from their lips at all, but from some echo in the chapel itself. Others said they did sing, but in whispers so faint that the words were stripped of meaning, reduced to a dull, wavering hum. What little sound could be heard was discordant, as though the children did not understand the melodies. Their whispers drifted out of tune, clashing with the organ and the voices of the congregation. The effect was unnerving, like a choir that existed slightly out of step with the world, shadows of hymns rather than the real thing. One woman described it as the sound of children who had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Another parishioner recalled turning to watch them once, only to see their faces fixed and blank, their mouths moving, but their eyes glassy, as though the act of singing were no more than a practiced ritual, stripped of joy. Over time, families began to dread those Sundays. The soundless presence of the orphans hung over the service like a cold draft, draining the warmth from prayer and sermon alike. Parents hushed their own children more quickly, as if to shield them from the strange contagion of stillness that followed the orphans. By the time the final hymn was sung and the congregation filed out into the daylight, relief was written on every face. Yet when they glanced back at the chapel doors, the orphans remained, waiting silently until the rest of the town had gone. No one ever saw them speak to each other. No one ever heard them laugh or cry. They came and went as though bound to some ritual older than the church itself. And always the hymns lingered thin, broken, and whispered, like echoes of a faith that had long since been hollowed out. Those who dealt most directly with St. Hallows were the tradesmen and laborers who delivered its supplies. They were the butchers carrying crates of salted pork, the farmers hauling sacks of grain, the seamstresses dropping off bundles of repaired garments. At first, they spoke with a kind of reverence about their work, proud to be serving a place that sheltered orphans in their time of need. But as the years passed, that pride soured into unease, for each delivery brought with it glimpses of details that never sat comfortably in memory. The most common observation was that large sections of the orphanage were always closed off. Doors in its corridors remained locked at all hours, their handles rusted from disuse, their thresholds collecting dust no broom ever disturbed. Deliveries were never permitted beyond the main hall or kitchen. When asked why the rooms beyond could not be entered, Margaret would give her quiet, practiced reply that they were storage or unsafe or undergoing repairs. Yet decades passed and those doors never opened. Workers who caught a glance through the narrow cracks in their frames claimed to have seen strange arrangements of furniture inside, beds neatly made but unoccupied, chairs set in perfect circles, as though waiting for a gathering that never came. Even stranger were the windows. Many of the tall, arched panes were nailed shut from within, heavy planks crossing them like bars, blotting out the sunlight. Those who carried supplies to the side entrances remarked that the boards seemed freshly hammered, the nails gleaming as though regularly replaced. Some swore they heard faint tapping from behind those shuttered windows, as if small hands pressed against the wood. Once, a milkman reported that as he approached with his cart, he saw an eye staring through a narrow slit between the boards, unblinking, wide, and pale, vanishing the moment he raised his voice. He never returned to St. Hallows again. Stories like his multiplied. A mason called in to repair a section of the outer wall claimed to hear shuffling footsteps and muffled whispers from the locked wing above, though he had been assured it was empty. A seamstress delivering coats said that when Margaret led her down the hallway, she felt a cold draft push out from beneath one of the locked doors, carrying with it a sour chemical scent. And though she dared not look, she swore something scraped softly along the other side, as if following her steps. Over time, the town's tradesmen began refusing to enter altogether. They left their goods at the gates, knocking once before hurrying away, content to let Reverend Grieve's attendants collect the parcels. The orphanage had become a house of shuttered eyes, its windows sealed against both light and watchful gazes, its corridors swallowed in locked silence. Whatever lay hidden in those rooms, the town came to believe it was not meant for their eyes. And as those boarded windows multiplied, so too did the sense that St. Hallows was less a home for children than a fortress designed to keep something within. Clara Bell was only 7 years old when her name was entered into the intake book at St. Hallows. Her mother had died the year before, and her father, a miner named Samuel Bell, struggled to provide for her while keeping steady work in the dangerous shafts outside town. With little family left to turn to, he made the difficult decision to entrust his daughter to Reverend Grieve and Margaret, believing the orphanage would offer her safety, schooling, and companionship among other children. Witnesses recalled the day clearly. Samuel walked Clara to the gates himself, her small hand clutching his, her hair tied back with a ribbon her mother had once worn. She looked frightened, but she obeyed when Margaret knelt and whispered to her gently, leading her inside. Samuel lingered at the gate long after she disappeared into the building, convincing himself he had done the right thing. For months afterward, he sent coins when he could spare them, along with small gifts, a handkerchief stitched with her initials, a book of verses her mother had loved. He received polite thank-you notes in Margaret's careful handwriting, but never a word from Clara herself. Work kept him from visiting, but when the mind slowed and his hours eased, he decided to see her with his own eyes. It had been nearly 8 months since he left her there, and he longed to hear her voice again. When he arrived at St. Hallow's, the Reverend greeted him coolly at the door. Samuel asked to see Clara, his voice filled with anticipation, but the Reverend's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "Clara has moved on," he said, as though the words should suffice. Confused, Samuel pressed for details. Was she adopted? By whom? Where had she gone? But no papers were produced, no signatures from prospective parents, no county filings. Margaret appeared at her brother's side, her expression strained, and repeated the same phrase. "She has moved on." Samuel's voice rose in anger. He demanded entry, demanded to see proof, demanded to know if his daughter still lived within those walls. The Reverend's response was to shut the door firmly in his face. Witnesses in town later said Samuel staggered down from the orphanage hill, pale with fury and fear, shouting that his daughter had been stolen from him. He went to the sheriff, but the records showed nothing. No adoption papers, no death certificate, no burial permit. Clara Bell had simply vanished from existence. Her father continued to search for years, writing letters to surrounding counties, chasing rumors of families who had taken in children, but her name was never found again. In time, people whispered that Clara was not the first child to vanish from St. Hallows, and she would not be the last. To the townsfolk, her disappearance became the first undeniable crack in the facade of charity that cloaked the orphanage, proof that behind those shuttered windows and locked doors, something unspeakable was taking place. Every so often, though rarely, the children of St. Hallows were seen beyond the orphanage gates. Margaret would lead them into town in small groups, their dark clothing setting them apart from the bright, patched garments of the local children. These outings were said to be for supplies or for brief appearances at church gatherings, though they never lingered and never strayed from her side. At first, the townsfolk greeted them warmly, eager to show kindness to the orphans who had suffered so much. But the warmth of those greetings soon gave way to unease, for there was something undeniably strange about the way the children moved and behaved when seen up close. They walked stiffly, as though their joints had forgotten the fluidity of childhood. Their steps were measured, deliberate, too synchronized for comfort, as if they had been taught to march rather than stroll. Their eyes rarely met those of the people who addressed them. Instead, they seemed to look past or through the person speaking, their gazes unfocused, glassy, detached from the moment at hand. When prompted to respond, they spoke slowly, with halting words that emerged in a monotone, lacking the inflection or spontaneity of youth. Questions as simple as, "How are you, dear?" or "Do you like your lessons?" were met with clipped phrases. "We are well." "Yes. We learn." Never more, never less. It was not merely their manner but the absence of play that disturbed the villagers most. Other children, even those in grief, found moments to laugh, to chase each other, to whisper secrets. But the orphans of St. Hallows displayed none of this. When gathered in the square or standing at the church steps, they stood silently, hands folded or at their sides, waiting without impatience but without curiosity. An old woman who once tried to offer them candy swore that the children accepted it politely, held the sweets in their palms, but never unwrapped or ate them. They looked at it as though it were foreign, she said, like they did not know what to do with it. In time, people began to describe them not as children at all but as something else entirely. Puppets, some said, with movements too stiff and voices too unnatural. Others called them hollow things, empty shells that mimicked life without ever embodying it. Parents warned their own children not to linger when the orphans appeared, fearful that their stillness might be contagious. And though Margaret always thanked the townsfolk for their kindness, her smile was strained, her eyes watchful, as though daring anyone to question what they saw. After each outing, the orphans disappeared once more behind the orphanage gates, leaving only whispers in their wake, whispers that grew heavier with every sighting. Those children were not like ours, and perhaps they were not children at all. In the spring of 1905, a troubling pattern began to weigh heavily on the county. Several children from surrounding farms and nearby hamlets had gone missing over the span of 2 years. Their families reported them lost after storms, after trips to market, or during long days spent wandering fields and riverbanks. At first, each disappearance was treated as an isolated tragedy. The woods were dense, the rivers swift, and the dangers of rural life were many. But as the numbers grew, concern sharpened into suspicion, and whispers began to circle around the one place no one wished to accuse openly: St. Hallow's Orphanage. Sheriff Elias Dunley, a man known for his blunt manner and unyielding sense of duty, decided to investigate. He had heard the rumors about the children within its walls, how they never seemed to age, how their voices carried no laughter. He had also heard the cries of parents who begged him to search the orphanage grounds, to demand answers from Reverend Grieve. With mounting pressure, he rode up the orphanage hill one overcast afternoon, accompanied by 2 deputies, and requested entry. Grieve met him at the door with the same cold composure that unnerved so many, but the sheriff's authority could not be refused. What Dunley found inside he recorded in a series of notes that would never make it into public record but survived in fragments, discovered decades later in a locked drawer of his desk. His words were not the language of a man convinced of criminal neglect or simple cruelty. They carried instead the tone of someone who had seen something he could not fully explain. He described rows of children in the main hall sitting in silence, their eyes vacant, their breathing shallow. They answered his questions when prompted, but their words felt rehearsed, repeated from memory rather than formed in thought. He wrote, "They are alive but not living. Their bodies persist, but there is no vitality. It is as though they have been hollowed out." The sheriff searched the locked wings but found nothing beyond empty rooms and nailed windows. Grieve stood at his side throughout, offering explanations about storage, safety, and the orphanage's sacred mission. Margaret hovered nearby, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting toward the children with something that looked closer to fear than devotion. Dunley left that day without the evidence he had hoped to find, but with a sense of unease he could never shake. His notes ended with a chilling admission. "If the missing are here, they are not as they once were. I cannot prove it, but I know it." The case was quietly dropped soon after. Officially, the missing children were listed as runaways, presumed lost to the dangers of the wilderness, or carried off by unknown hands. Unofficially, the sheriff's silence became its own answer. He never spoke of St. Hallow's again, and when pressed by grieving families, he only shook his head and said there was nothing more he could do. The town understood, though none dared to say it aloud. Something was wrong in that orphanage, but whatever it was lay beyond the reach of law. In 1929, a weary county clerk named Thomas Albright stumbled upon something that would trouble him for the rest of his days. Albright had worked in the records office for more than 20 years, and while his job was monotonous, it gave him an eye for details that others often overlooked. He was tasked with reviewing old census data in preparation for the upcoming 1930 count, ensuring that the records of the county were consistent and accurate. Most of it was routine: farmers with their growing families, widows now marked as living alone, children who had aged into adults with households of their own. But when he reached the records of St. Bogsall, with households of their own, Hallow's Orphanage, his pen froze above the paper. The names did not change. Year after year, across 3 decades, the same children were listed. Joseph, 8 years old. Clara, 6 years old. Matthew, 10 years old. These entries appeared not just once but consistently, as if time had skipped over the orphanage entirely. Each census was supposed to reflect the growth and decline of a community. Children grew, they aged, they eventually left the orphanage for work or adoption. Yet here, in this place, they remained exactly as they had first been recorded. It was not simply odd, it was impossible. Albright thought at first it might be clerical error, perhaps a lazy hand copying over old lists. But when he examined the signatures, he found they were authenticated each time by Reverend Grieve himself, the ink fading with age, but the names always the same. Curious, Albright retrieved adoption records, but none of the listed children had ever been placed in homes. He checked death records, too, no trace. The children lived on paper, suspended in the same age forever, neither leaving nor dying, never shifting from their assigned year. When Albright brought this to his superior, he was told to drop it. The orphanage, after all, had long been a source of quiet unease, and the county officials were in no mood to stir it further. "Don't trouble yourself with ghosts in the books," the head clerk muttered, pushing the file back into the stack. But Albright could not forget. He kept a private copy of the census lists, tucked away in his home, a reminder that something unnatural was festering just beyond the town's borders. Later, when neighbors asked why he often sat awake late into the night staring at papers by candlelight, Albright would only say one thing: "I keep seeing the same children. They've been waiting there for 30 years. It was a statement that chilled even those who didn't believe in curses or hauntings. The county's official records never corrected the error. Joseph remained 8 years old in 1900, and in 1910, and again in 1920, and even in 1930. And on paper, at least, he would stay that way forever. The summer of 1912 brought a terrible drought to rural Kentucky. The fields cracked, the wells dipped low, and every house in town seemed to hold its breath, fearful that the smallest spark might ignite disaster. That was the year the fire came to St. Hallow's Orphanage, a night the locals would whisper about for generations, though no one could ever quite agree on what they had seen. It began just past midnight, when a traveling peddler noticed an orange glow flickering against the sky. By the time the town's fire brigade arrived, the chapel roof of the orphanage was engulfed, flames licking up the wooden steeple like hungry fingers reaching for heaven. The men rushed forward with buckets and hoses, but what unsettled them most was not the fire itself, it was the sight of the children within. Through the smoke-blackened windows, dozens of small figures stood motionless. They did not pound on the glass or call for help. They did not cry or cough. Their pale faces seemed to glow in the firelight, their eyes vacant, their bodies unnervingly still. One firefighter later wrote, "They looked like mannequins propped up in the flames, as if the fire did not belong to them, and they did not belong to the fire." The men shouted for Reverend Grieve to evacuate the building, but he only stood at the chapel's entrance, his face calm, his voice low, repeating a prayer none of the men could quite hear. Margaret Grieve, his sister, moved briskly among the children who had gathered outside on the lawn, her hands clasped as if guiding them in silent worship rather than escape. Witnesses swore she showed no fear, and more curiously, neither did the children. Then came the strangest part. The flames, which had consumed the roof in mere minutes, suddenly stilled. Firefighters were baffled as the inferno collapsed in on itself, like a candle being snuffed out by unseen fingers. The air grew cold, the embers died quickly, and what should have been a smoldering ruin was instead a blackened but intact building. Not a single child was harmed, nor did anyone emerge coughing or burned. It was as though the fire had been permitted to exist only briefly, then denied its nature and forced to retreat. The townsfolk who witnessed it whispered of divine intervention, while others murmured of something darker, some pact that twisted the laws of nature. The firefighters, hardened men who had pulled bodies from ash before, confessed privately that what unsettled them most was not the sudden end of the fire, but the silence of the children who stood within it. No screams, no panic, not even a flinch. As one of them said years later, voice hushed over his glass at the tavern, "I'd rather hear a child cry in fear than stand in the presence of one who won't." By the years following the fire, the whispers about Reverend Silas Grieve grew louder than the tolling of the chapel bell itself. For a man who had once been embraced as a godly figure, his name began to carry the weight of unease, spoken in hushed tones as though uttering it aloud might invite something unwelcome into one's home. Locals started to claim that Silas had not simply built a sanctuary for abandoned children, but rather a vessel for his own unsettling ideas, what he called, in private writings later discovered, the preservation of innocence. The phrase was hauntingly vague, yet it held a terrible suggestion. Silas had long preached about the corruption of the world, the way poverty, hunger, and cruelty devoured children before they had the chance to grow into the image of God. He was obsessed with the notion that time itself was the greatest corrupter, that growing up meant inevitable sin. His solution, it seemed, was not to save souls in the traditional sense, but to bind them in a state of unchanging purity, neither growing older nor facing death. In diaries attributed to him, hidden within the church vestry and unearthed decades later, passages describe experiments conducted under the guise of prayer. The children must not cross into the corruption of years, one line read. Better they remain as they are, untouched, unspoiled, bound within the holy stillness. He spoke of sealing them between breaths, as though their lives were caught in a pause, suspended on the edge of existence where death could not claim them and life could not progress. Some in town believed he sought divine intervention, a miracle of eternal childhood. Others whispered of rituals performed after midnight in the chapel, where faint candlelight flickered against boarded windows and low chants carried across the fields. Farmhands reported hearing the voices of children carried on the wind, thin, strained, as if echoing from some place in between. Even his sister Margaret seemed complicit. Though she never preached, she guarded the orphanage's locked rooms with quiet determination, ensuring no outsider lingered too long or asked too many questions. It was said that her gaze was harder than his sermons, and that she believed completely in his work. What unsettled the townspeople most was not just the strange endurance of the children, but the thought that Reverend Grieve may have succeeded in his terrible ambition. If no child was ever recorded as dying within St. Hallow's, if no birth ever officially began there, then what exactly were they? Were they alive in the way a child should be, or had Silas bound them in some other state, something neither here nor gone, neither innocent nor free? The curse of Reverend Grieve, as it came to be called, was not merely that he had experimented with faith, but that he may have trapped dozens of souls in a condition far more dreadful than death. When the parish hall of St. Hallow's was finally emptied in the 1940s, long after the orphanage had been shuttered and the last whispers had faded into folklore, a discovery was made that reignited every rumor. A caretaker sorting through a box of forgotten ledgers and hymnals found a bundle of old leather-bound notebooks wrapped in burlap and tucked deep inside the church archive. The handwriting was not Reverend Silas Grieve's but his sister Margaret's. Unlike her brother, who preached loudly and scribbled lofty sermons about purity, Margaret wrote with the quiet hand of someone who believed she was recording truth, not allegory. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, dates, symbols, and phrases that blurred the line between religious devotion and something far more arcane. She described formulas, created not from herbs or medicine, but from incantations stitched together with scripture, psalms twisted into what she called binding verses. There were references to circles of salt laid in hidden chambers, oils anointed not on foreheads, but on door frames and window sills, as if the building itself needed sealing against the passage of time. One entry spoke of candles burning for 3 days straight, their wax collected and buried beneath the chapel altar. Another mentioned the repetition of a prayer she claimed could still the breath without stilling the body. The most chilling passages were not the rituals themselves but the outcomes she proudly noted. They do not age, they do not die, they simply remain, she wrote, as though chronicling a miracle. Again and again, she referred to the children as the preserved ones. She described them with admiration, marveling that Joseph was as lively at age 8 in 1905 as he had been when first admitted in 1898, that Clara's smile shone unblemished by sorrow, even though, by calendar years, she should have been nearly a woman. Her tone was not one of fear, but reverence. To Margaret, This was salvation, a triumph over the corruption of the world. She saw her brother's work not as unnatural, but as holy preservation. In one passage, however, a crack in her certainty appears. At times they look upon me with eyes that do not shine as before. It is as though they know they are not free, though they cannot speak it. The line is underlined twice, the ink pressed so deeply into the paper it nearly tore through. Historians who later studied the journals debated their meaning. Were they the writings of a devout woman caught in delusion, reshaping her grief and isolation into ritual? Or were they the testimony of someone who had truly witnessed the impossible, binding children to a state neither alive in fullness nor dead in peace? Whatever the truth, Margaret's secret writings gave form to what had always been rumor. The orphanage was not simply a place of shelter, but a chamber where time itself was forced to stand still, leaving its inhabitants trapped in a twilight existence no one could explain. When the orphanage finally closed its doors in the late 1930s, the last generation of staff scattered across Kentucky, many choosing never to speak of what they had seen within its walls. Yet over the years, fragments of testimony emerged, murmured recollections that painted a picture far darker than the town's polite histories. A cook, now elderly and living with her daughter, recalled how she spent each morning preparing stews and loaves of bread for the children. The food was hearty, meant to sustain growing bodies, yet she swore the pots were never emptied. "I would set the bowls before them," she whispered to an interviewer decades later, but their mouths hardly moved. They would sit there, staring down, stirring the broth without lifting it to their lips. And when I cleared the tables, the bread was untouched, the meat still steaming. Yet somehow they never starved, they never grew thin. Her words echoed the strangeness reported by others who had walked the halls of St. Hallows. The groundskeeper, a man named Edwin Lowry, left behind a short written account discovered after his death. In it, he described nights spent patrolling the overgrown lawns, lantern in hand, listening for wolves or trespassers. More often than not, it was not animals he glimpsed, but children, small figures in white nightshirts moving silently across the grounds. They walked the perimeter, their feet bare on the frost, he wrote. They never spoke, never called to one another. I tried once to follow, but when I turned the corner of the building, they were gone, as though they had melted into the stone. He admitted he began carrying a Bible in his coat pocket after that, though he rarely opened it. It was not for reading, his note confessed. It was to hold tight, so I knew something holy was still with me. Other fragments of testimony hinted at even stranger truths. A laundress spoke of bedding that never dirtied, sheets that smelled faintly of candle wax rather than children's sweat. A handyman swore the locked rooms on the second floor seemed to breathe, as if the walls themselves expanded and contracted in the night. Few stayed employed at St. Felic's. Hallow's long. Turnover was constant, yet records show that replacements were always found quickly, often churchwomen who never again spoke of their work once they left. These accounts, scattered and fragile, form a mosaic of unease. None prove anything outright, yet together they point toward a reality too strange to dismiss. By the time the orphanage neared its final years, even the workers seemed to sense they were tending not to children, but to something else entirely, figures that looked and moved like orphans, but who belonged neither to the living nor the dead. It was a fragile illusion of care, propped up by routine, until the weight of silence and secrecy grew too heavy to contain. That weight would soon drag St. Hallows to its inevitable collapse, leaving behind only the testimonies of those who dared to remember. In the winter of 1936, a silence fell over St. Hallows' home that the town would never forget. It began subtly, with supply wagons turned away at the gate. The driver, accustomed to delivering flour and salted pork, reported that the iron gates were chained from the inside and no one came to receive his goods. At first, townsfolk thought it was the bitter cold that kept the orphans indoors. Snow had drifted high that year, the roads nearly impassable, and Reverend Grieve's home was known to be self-sufficient. But as days stretched into weeks, the stillness around the property grew unsettling. Smoke no longer curled from the chimneys. No faint hymns carried on the wind. The windows, once dimly lit in the evenings, stared black and hollow into the night. Concern spread through the town until finally, a small party of men led by Sheriff Dunley forced their way through the gate. What they found inside has remained one of Kentucky's most enduring mysteries. The dormitories were perfectly arranged, beds smoothed and pillows fluffed, yet every room was empty. Bowls of food sat upon long dining tables, some still half filled with stew that had neither rotted nor frozen despite the season's chill. Bread loaves lay sliced and waiting, but no bite had been taken. The silence of the place was deeper than ordinary. Quiet it pressed against the men's ears, as if the very air refused to carry sound. The chapel, too, stood prepared as if for a service. Candles had been placed at each pew, their wicks unburned but oddly warm to the touch, as though they had only just been snuffed out. Hymnals lay open, pages marked, but no voices had sung from them in days or perhaps years. The men spread through the grounds, searching for some trace of the orphans, but there were no footprints in the snow leading away from the building. No carts, no belongings removed. It was as though every soul inside had vanished in an instant, leaving behind only the shell of routine. Whispers spread quickly. Some claimed Reverend Silas Grieve had finally succeeded in his experiments, carrying the children beyond the grasp of both time and death. Others swore it was punishment that the orphanage had been swallowed whole for meddling in forbidden matters. The sheriff filed no official report, only noting that the grounds were found vacant. And so the case, like so many tied to St. Hallow's, was quietly closed. To this day, no remains have ever been uncovered. The dormitories, the untouched meals, the warm but unlit candles remain as fragments of a final scene, frozen in time. St. Hallow's home had locked its gates one winter morning and never reopened them, leaving behind a question too large for the town, and perhaps for history itself to answer. Beside St. Hallow's home, separated only by a low stone wall, lay a stretch of land that should have been filled with sorrow. It was the orphanage's graveyard, set aside from the very day the home was founded. The ground was cleared, the soil measured, and Reverend Grieve himself blessed it before the first children ever arrived. In the years that followed, the townsfolk assumed it had seen its use. After all, children fall ill, accidents happen. Life in Kentucky at the turn of the century was hard, and no one escaped death's shadow for long. And yet, decade after decade, the graveyard remained empty. Not a single headstone rose from the earth. Not a single mound of dirt marked a burial. The grass grew even and untouched, broken only by the gnarled roots of old oaks that twisted along the boundary. Locals who visited the grounds remarked that the soil there seemed wrong somehow, dry even after heavy rain, almost unwilling to receive what it was made for. One farmer, who once helped deliver timber to the home, whispered that he had seen small figures moving through the graveyard at night. They did not weep or play. They merely stood among the trees as though waiting for something or someone that never came. The absence of graves became a point of unease for the county. When census clerks compared lists, they noticed that no death certificates had ever been issued for the children of St. Hallow's. The orphanage, according to official record, had never buried a single soul. For some, this was explained away as providence proof that Reverend Grieve's prayers and Margaret's care had preserved the little ones from tragedy. For others, it was evidence of something darker. How could so many children live in one place for 40 years without a single death? Not even a fever, not an accident, not one misstep into the graveyard? As years went on, the graveyard became an object of dread. Deliveries would be left at the gate rather than carried across its perimeter. Schoolboys dared one another to run the length of the fence, though few made it past halfway before their courage broke. And always the same detail was spoken of in hushed tones. On some nights, faint outlines could be seen standing in the yard. Not shadows, not tricks of moonlight, but the forms of children motionless, silent, their faces hidden in the dark. The graveyard of St. Hallows was not empty in the truest sense. It held no graves, no markers, no memory of mourning. But in its stillness, in its untouched earth, it bore witness to the most unsettling truth of all. Here was a place set aside for death, yet death never came. And perhaps that was the most terrifying thing of all. By the 1970s, St. Hallows had long been abandoned, its brick walls cracking under the weight of ivy and time. The roof sagged in places where storms had ripped through, and the once proud chapel bell tower leaned like a weary sentinel. For locals, it was a place best avoided, whispered about, but rarely approached. But for a new generation, drawn to forgotten places and haunted lore, the orphanage became a destination. Urban explorers armed with flashlights, tape recorders, and the bravado of youth began to sneak past the rusting gates and into the ruins. What they found there only deepened the legend. The first group came in the summer of 1974, college students chasing a thrill. They brought cameras to document their adventure, laughing as they posed before the orphanage's locked doors. But inside, the tone shifted. One recalled hearing faint footsteps on the upper floor, soft and quick, though the dust on the stairs showed no disturbance. Another swore she heard a giggle behind her, high and childlike, though the hall was empty when they turned. They left before midnight, shaken but exhilarated. When the photographs were developed, a shadowy figure could be seen standing in the background of one shot, a figure the students swore had not been there. By the 1980s, the orphanage was infamous among thrill-seekers. Paranormal groups carried recording equipment into its rotting dormitories. Some returned with tapes filled with what they claimed were voices, faint, overlapping, hard to decipher, but undeniably the voices of children. A chilling refrain repeated in several accounts, a chorus that seemed to whisper or chant, "We are still here." Investigators who heard it described a deep unease that lingered for days, as though the words had followed them home. Other reports were more visual. A pair of explorers in 1991 described seeing small shapes flit past boarded windows. They assumed it was other trespassers until they realized the shadows were moving on the second floor, where the boards were nailed from the inside and no one could have gained entry. In another case, a young man claimed he felt a tug on his sleeve while walking through the chapel. He turned, expecting to see a friend, but found only the outline of a small handprint pressed into the dust on his coat. Over time, the stories built upon each other until St. Hallows was regarded as one of Kentucky's most haunted places. Local police discouraged trespassing, but they too admitted strange happenings. Unexplained lights flickering in the windows, the sound of faint singing when the building should have been empty. For those who entered, the most haunting truth was not what they saw but what they felt, a presence thick in the air, the weight of dozens of unseen eyes. And always, in the silence, came that whispered refrain carried through empty halls, "We are still here." The story of St. Hallows' home leaves behind more questions than answers, and perhaps that is why its legend has endured for more than a century. The archives reveal fragments, journals, census records, testimonies, but never the whole truth. What remains is a patchwork of horror and fascination, enough to keep the imagination circling the same haunting possibilities. Did Reverend Silas Grieve truly discover a way to halt the passage of time, to freeze a soul in a half-life state where neither growth nor decay was possible? Or was the orphanage simply a carefully constructed prison, not for the body but for innocence itself, trapping children in a condition so unnatural that even their voices became nothing more than echoes of a forgotten hymn? Reverend Grieve, remembered by some as a visionary and by others as a zealot, may have believed he was preserving purity in a corrupt world. But preservation, once stretched beyond the natural order, becomes indistinguishable from captivity. The children, if they can still be called that, may never have had a chance to grow into themselves, forever confined in the shell of youth, their laughter brittle, their songs off-key. What once might have been joy calcified into something unearthly, something that unsettled all who encountered it. Margaret Grieve's journals, with their cryptic references to formulas and rituals, give a chilling glimpse into how far this family was willing to go in pursuit of their ideal. And yet, nowhere in her words does one find mention of mercy, of release, of what life meant for those kept in such a state. When the orphanage gates locked in 1936, the silence that followed did not feel like an ending but a pause, as though the story of St. Hallows had only shifted form. Those who trespassed in later years came away with stories of shadows, whispers, and a chorus that claimed, "We are still here." If true, then the children were not gone but lingering, suspended in a loop of existence that neither death nor time could claim. The thought itself is enough to curdle the heart, that innocence, rather than being cherished, could be weaponized into something eternal and unnatural. And so a warning has survived with the legend, passed quietly through generations of locals, whispered to anyone curious enough to wander too close. It is a simple but chilling admonition. If ever you hear the sound of children singing in a place long abandoned, do not linger, do not investigate, turn away. Some songs are not meant for the living, and once heard, they may never let you go.